I'm really happy to be able to present today. My friends, Jeanette Armstrong, many of you know Jeanette. She's a member of the Penticton Indian Band. She started the Okanagan Center. She's a professor of Indigenous Studies at UBC Okanagan, and she's now an Order of Canada and a public intellectual, so she's getting off and on planes going all over the world. And Lally Brower, my colleague in English for many decades at UBCO, now retired as well. They both send their regrets that they can't be here today. We decided many decades ago that it was about time that women got written into history a little bit more than they had been. In the BC interior, there was a groundbreaking article by Jean Barman in the 1990s called Lost Okanagan, and it's about the settler men who came into the interior and often had made strategic marriages with Indigenous women. The first families in the contact period with white people were the families of mixed heritage of these unions, but that for a long time was completely whitewashed out of history. Instead, we got a lot of the idea of a genteel frontier here in the not here so much, but in the Okanagan, definitely. And Margaret Ormsby, who did some great foundational work in BC Studies and History, she was instrumental. And Leonard Norris, who headed up the Okanagan Historical Society in its early years, they were instrumental in promulgating that kind of mythology. Anyway, we wanted to remedy that and look at the relations between Indigenous women, mixed heritage women, and the white settler women. And so we scoured all kinds of archives, museums, we bothered descendants. I was really fortunate to get lots of help from descendants in the Allison family for my work on Susan Allison. And we were amazed at how much there was out there. This was the person I worked on, very well known to all of you in this room, very likely. This first, this is the original cover of her memoirs. They are still in print from UBC Press. And this is Margaret Ormsby's title, A Pioneer Gentlewoman in British Columbia. They were originally newspaper articles, a series of them in the Vancouver papers in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And then this is a picture of Susan Allison late in life with a coyote, a tame coyote. The Allison, she was on a visit here to Princeton from Vancouver where she'd retired. But the Allisons were well known for all kinds of animals of every kind living in the house. And travelers through what was called Allisons in this area often commented on this. Very interesting person. When I first read her recollections, I thought this is not like some of those very proper, gentle women, middle-class British women who left memoirs in Ontario, like Susanna Moodie and Catherine Partrail. They had little to nothing to do with Indigenous people. This person has some inside knowledge, and that just proved to be true the more I dug into it. She always had a lot of respect for the Similkameen people and was a kind of an amateur ethnographer, and remarkable given that she raised 14 children and was a stock raiser as well, and so on. This is one of the women whose work we looked at as well and published. And so you can see we brought together a lot of work from all kinds of different places. Josephine Shuttleworth, you'll see that her dates are much later than Susan Allison's. Susan Allison was born in 1845, but we start to get the voice of Indigenous and mixed heritage women into the 1860s and 70s because they're getting more education, a little bit of education, whatever, and they leave their traces. And beside her is her daughter Louise. Josephine Shuttleworth was an orchardist and farmer at OK Falls. She was married to a fellow named Harry Shuttleworth, who was a person of mixed heritage. His father was Henry Shuttleworth from England. Anyway, she related many stories, many of the Syilx stories, the Chaptequel, and I'm mispronouncing it, Chaptequel of the Syilx people, to her neighbor Isabel McNaughton, who was another interesting settler. She came to the Okanagan very late. She's not really an early settler, but McNaughton transcribed these stories and made something of them, had them published, had them turned into plays, and they were picked up by a teacher on the Incowmasket Reserve named Anthony Walsh, who created plays and had the kids from the Incowmasket Reserve enact roles in these stories, and they did lots of art around these, visual art and so forth, and they went on the road to Vancouver and places like that. They were on the CBC. So that's how the orature starts to get transmitted. This is Isabel Christie McNaughton, who was the one who brought Josephine's stories to the fore. And this is Eliza Jane Swalwell. We have published some of her stuff. It's very sad we don't have any more of it. Her father was a very stern Scots Protestant who really valued study. And her mother was the daughter of Chief Pantherhead from the West Bank Reserve. She spent most of her life around the north of Kelowna in the Lake Country area. That's her on the far right. And this is from her essay, which is in our book. She's very astute, a real A-plus student, and really, she's a really good writer. But her understanding that the fact she stands between cultures really shows in her writing, because she has a lot of insight. She says, I do not know whether this, she's talking about her own responsiveness to nature, I do not know whether this responsiveness to certain beautiful aspects of nature comes to me from my Indian mother or from my father's side of the house, but it probably comes from my mother's side. It seems to me the whites are too much bound and limited, too much enslaved by their written creeds and confessions of faith. The Indians are free of that, and consequently they are closer to nature and reality. And then she goes on to very astutely call out, you know, the obsession in Western culture with print and what's in print as bona fide truth, which we now know is kind of misguided. And this is Marie Houghton Brent. Marie was the daughter of a captain in the English Army named Charles Houghton. He was an Anglo-Irishman. A lot of Anglo-Irish men from the British Army and Civil Service ended up in the Okanagan and in the interior. But her father was MP a couple of times out of the Vernon area, and he came with the Vernon brothers, Forbes Vernon, and I've forgotten his George Vernon, and he owned part of the Coldstream Ranch. But at any rate, Marie was the daughter of Houghton and his Indigenous wife, Sophie Naquala. Sophie was a granddaughter of the great Chief Naquala, who was mentioned. He was the most important chief in the fur trade days. And lots and lots of trace of him. He was a great chief, and she was very proud of her heritage on both sides. She was, as many of these women who were wives of or children of some of the first male settlers, their families were the very important families in their communities. Anyway, she wrote all kinds of delightful things about going to school in early Kelowna, the first school, and just how they lived. And when she was about 10 or 11, her father sent for her to come and take care of him in Ottawa. He was a noted enough alcoholic that it's even made it into the Dictionary of Canadian Biography to this day. And the entry there calls attention to John A. Macdonald saying, you can't send that man out to Batoche or whatever. He'll be too drunk. But anyway.
He was head of the militia in BC and put down the strike in 1877.
Okay.
Always described as always more or less drunk.
Yeah. More or less. Good to know. Anyway, she left quite a body of work and was lots of things we wouldn't know without her history, lots of things about Indigenous people. This is Hester Haynes White. She was a daughter of an important settler, John Carmichael Haynes, Haynes Point in Penticton. Haynes was a stipendiary magistrate. He was known as Judge Haynes, and he had a huge ranch at Syilx. And she wrote an awful lot of she's really very much a kind of OHS person, I would call her. They wrote up a lot of history of their fathers, settlement history that created these larger-than-life figures of their fathers and their mothers to some extent, too. But that's a picture of her on the left when she's just a child. She's on the far left. And then that's a picture of her when she's older. Now, interestingly, she grew up with, she had two half-siblings who were of Indigenous descent. Her father's two children from his early marriage, or his first marriage, with a woman named Julie Abraham from Colville. And Johnny Haynes, John Carmichael Haynes Jr., was well known around Kelowna, and Mary Haynes as well. But, of course, Hester never whispered a word about that, ever, ever. She did, however, we found correspondence between her and Mourning Dove, the famous Syilx writer, and between Hester and one of their Indigenous servants, Matilda Kruger. Matilda and Mary Kruger were the children of a German settler known as Theodore Kruger, who Kruger Mountain, and another one in the panoply of the early stockmen here. Anyway, in the 1920s and 30s, Hester Haynes White is wanting to write a biography of her father, so she gets in touch with Matilda, who is down on the Colville Reserve. In her recollections, Hester talks about, you get the impression that Matilda did everything for the family of 5 kids. Her mother was always, taking peach water and going and laying down and things. Anyway, she described her as mother's right hand, etc. Was she ever? Anyway, this is what Matilda wrote back in 1934 as an older woman. We left lots of stories out, so she and her sister got together and wrote up some things they remembered about growing up around the Haynes Ranch. We left lots of stories out because it was hard and unpleasant memory of our young days. It was nothing but hard work and no schooling. When we came to Uncle Sam, we were treated like human beings and went to school. Had a very nice time. We went to Chamawa school through our mother because she belonged here. So that's a kind of let's not put on our rose-colored glasses here, but for all it was worth. So it's these traces that we get of Indigenous and mixed heritage women that were really intriguing to us. And this is Mourning Dove. She's known as the first Native North American female author to be published, first person to publish a novel. And her name was Christine Quintasket. Jeanette is a descendant of hers, Jeanette Armstrong. She lived a really hard life, as many of these Indigenous and mixed heritage women did. They didn't have it easy. But she still managed to write an autobiography, a novel. She wrote all kinds of, she collected a book called Coyote Stories about using Syilx story about Coyote and other figures, and really quite remarkable. Her book, Kajuwea the Half-Blood, it's a typical courtship novel, a la Jane Austen. The search for the right guy, finding a mate, all that stuff. But it's troubled by racism because the fellow that she's sweet on is this evil guy named Alfred Densmore, who's a white New Yorker, a white guy from New York who's out to just use her and find out where gold is and so forth. So it's very astute, and it's in what she captures of the life of some of these women who lived between these two emerging worlds. And here we have, I'm going to keep the rest of this to the local area and Susan Allison, because that's my area of expertise, I guess you could call it. And this is Nora Yakumtikum on the far right. She's with somebody, or on the left. She's the older woman on the left, and she's with Maggie Turbasket, who was, anyway, I'm not exactly sure, but Jeanette identified her. And I want to just give you a sense of how we were looking for a trace of people. Nora was John Fall's first wife, and Susan Allison was well aware of her. Whether or not Susan knew that he had had an Indigenous marriage before Susan married John Fall, we will never know. But trying to find Nora in the records is kind of a challenge, and there are stories among descendants. I still need to do far more research and contact far more descendants than I have, but she was John Fall Allison's first wife and a woman of some means. Descendants on both sides whom I've talked to of the Allison family have told me she went back to her people. This is why she and John Fall had a kind of parting of the ways. That would make sense because Nora had her own pack train, and she showed John Fall Allison many of the routes into the Similkameen. She also, she was accruing some wealth before the Indian Act as well, before she didn't have the same agency that she had enjoyed. And he clearly needed someone to run his store at Princeton. He needed someone who would stay in one place, and that was not going to be Nora. So I don't know whether there was that putting away of the Indigenous wife that's become such a big part of, at least in the last 30 years, that there's been an outcry about how that went on so often, and it truly did. But anyway, this is a description of Nora from Susan Allison's memoirs of her first year in the Similkameen. It'd be the fall of 1868, just after she arrived. And she put this long paragraph in for a reason. She states, I had a visit from an Indian woman, a niece of Quiniscoe. You'll notice that in Allison's writing, she always identifies the kinship tie. And this is an indication of her transculturation, that she understands that this is super important to Indigenous people. They will know something about who this might be or the status of this person. A niece of Quiniscoe, the bear hunter, chief of the Chuchuea tribe. She was dressed for the occasion, of course, in mid-Victorian style, a Balmoral petticoat. A Balmoral petticoat is a petticoat underneath your long dress. And when you want to go skating, you just take this thing and you hitch it up and button it onto your dress so you can do axles or whatever. Anyway, the Indigenous women used to wear shorter chemise-length dresses, which were much more practical. But anyway, that's another story. A man's stiff starched white shirt as a blouse, stiff white collar, earrings an inch long, and brass bracelets. I did not know my visitor seemed to think she ought to sit upright in her chair and fix her eyes on the opposite wall. I think Klahaya was the only word she spoke. That's hello in Chinook. I knew very little Chinook. I felt very glad when her visit was over. I know now that I should have offered her a cigar and a cup of tea. So, any ideas about what's going on there?
I think that Mr. Allison's first wife was checking out the second one.
Exactly. And there's some Similkameen protocol there that Susan, as the newcomer, didn't understand.
Yeah.
I know now what I should have done. Also, she would have had many insider readers on both sides of the Allison family who would get a real kick out of this, because it's, for the general audience of white newspaper readers in Vancouver when this was published in the late 30s, in late 20s, early 30s, it'd be like, oh yeah, those women, here we have a typical, uncivilized looking la la la. No, this is just a kind of a commemoration of Nora. And very odd that white settler wife would want any trace of this person in her memoirs. But anyway, I think people she knew would get quite a chuckle out of this.
Is that directly from her diary, or is that written later?
That's from the recollections of a pioneer of the 1860s. So it's in A Pioneer Gentlewoman in British Columbia.
So it's from, she's writing looking back, or is she?
She's writing looking back in old age.
Okay.
Yeah.
But maybe from her own notes or something, or is she all from memory, do you think?
I think she writes letters. There are a lot of letters in her personal papers where she's asking people for help with dates, and she gets a number of dates wrong. But this is obviously a vivid memory, right? I suspect this was from, it was still there in the gray matter.
She's saying less than she knows, though.
Oh, she's very cagey. There's a real subtext here.
Yeah.
Because she's an insider, she understands. She's been I hate to use the word. I shouldn't, but I will. An ally. She's somebody who, she's like James Tate. She knows more about their life ways than. But how would this white urban audience in Vancouver take this? You got to preserve the pioneer myth, right? The trailblazer, John Fall Allison, da-da-da. Anyway.
Print the legend.
What?
Print the legend.
Print the legend, yeah, but leave a trace to commemorate and for the folks who know the real history. Anyway, her need to commemorate is really clear to me because a large part of her writing of all kinds, published and unpublished, is about the Similkameen people. And some about the Okanagan people because she was in the West Kelowna area for about 7 or 8 years. They had a ranch there, which is now Quail's Gate Winery. Anyway, her long poems Incowmasket and Quiniscoe are after their long poems based on the lives of the chiefs that she knew. Some Native Daughters I Have Known, really interesting stuff I'll talk about in a minute. Frequent depictions of Indigenous people coming and going, whatever, and who they are, where they came from, who they've married, in her recollections. And she published essays in the Royal Geographic Journal as well in London. And lots of Indigenous stories in her private papers. Also, she was working on something called The Tales of Tamtusalist. He was an old man, an elder, a Similkameen elder, whose son used to run a little ferry service across at the Forks. And he would take his father, he'd carry him into the store and dump him on a pile of skins because he couldn't walk. And Susan would spend the day with him, and he would tell her all these stories, and she would be writing them down on ledger paper, and she collected these, and some of them have appeared in print. Anyway, so very strong evidence of a need to remember or put together or create a record of people who are. She's fearing that they are going to be, that they are a dying people. And there's evidence of this in the introduction to her long poem, Incowmasket. She did not publish this introduction when she had Incowmasket published. She found a publisher in Chicago. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, this is what she states in her introduction. This must be taken as part of my recollections, for it is an account of the lives, manners, and customs of the Similkameen Indians as I knew them in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, while they were still a people. I may say a passing people. Now they are nearly gone, just a downtrodden remnant whose land is coveted and whose end is eagerly waited for by most of their white neighbors. The first part, that's the first part of her poem on Incowmasket, shows them a free people. They were in the majority. The second part, when they were coming under the influence of religion and civilization. They originally had their own beautiful religious ideas and their own manners and customs, which perhaps were not so beautiful from the white man's point of view, but they had no bestial thoughts, no maddening spirits. The white man has much to be ashamed of in his treatment of the rightful owners of the land. Very bold declaration, but this is what we in settler colonial studies call bad faith. Because, and you'll see expressions like this in settler memoirs and things, but she is the white man, right? She is part of the apparatus, as we all are, wherever we're positioned in a society where there is injustice. And how we respond to that is, it can be very fraught, right? Who was she going? She certainly does what she can on the side. She and John Fall write letters for a lot of the Indigenous people who aren't able to do so themselves, and they have a safe where they keep money and things like that, and gold dust, and they certainly their reputation was not that of some others who were much more deeply racist and so forth, but nonetheless it's a tough position. We also get traces of Lily in Allison's memoir, in her recollections. She was John Fall's daughter from his first marriage. She was born in 1863, so when Susan Allison's children came along, starting in 1868, Lily was old enough to help out, and she came to stay. This was very typical. The boys would often stay with the mother's people, and the girls would go with the white father to help with his new white family. With John Fall, she was with John Fall's second family off and on for many years, and very close to many members of that family. Allison writes of her, she never identifies her as a half-sibling to her kids, but she says, Lily said she would stay the winter, 1869 to 70. The winter passed much as the former one. We had a jolly little Christmas as before. Shortly after Christmas, some of Lily's people came, and she bawled to go with them. And then Allison says, and she had to go, and she missed all her cousins, and that must have been some of the Chichewea people and Nora's people, and so she went off with them for a while. It doesn't sound like she was compelled to stay, but then there was lots of pressure on Lily for her own survival to live with the Allisons. And anyway, but very little trace of Lily. I also found some of these sketches that I mentioned before that Allison wrote up at various times later in life. She wanted to create a book called Some Native Daughters I Have Known. And she wrote, there are 4 essays that I found, Gehennick, Penquinac. Gehennick was the sister of Quiniscoe, and a very rich woman with lots of land at Ashnola. Penquinac was the daughter of Incowmasket, the priest called him Moses. Our Louisa is a sketch about a woman from the Nicola. Some of you have read the book, and may have read that piece on Louisa, who comes to help the Allison family out at the house on the ranch when there's a measles epidemic and nobody can move. And then another one about a woman named Emma Hutch, or Hutchie, who farms with her white husband, who was a gold panner and who bought her a pair of sealskin boots for a wedding gift, which was a very rare thing. And Emma had lots of stories about men shoeing their horses with gold and things like that. Anyway, the one that I found most intriguing, and it's in the book, is called Gehennick. It's about an older Indigenous woman. I think it may be the woman known as Ashnola Mary, who was the sister of Ashnola John, who Johnny Chuchuaskin was a great chief in the Ashnola area and really stood up to a lot of what was going on. But anyway, she was the sister of Quiniscoe, and Allison writes in her sketch of Gehennick, she says, "From the other Indians, I learned that she was considered a rich woman. She possessed cattle and horses. She never rode any but the best horses and was utterly fearless. But she hated all white men." And that's the end of it. She goes on to something else. But if you know the history of the treatment of Indigenous women over the last 300 years or so, it goes without saying. But Allison is quite intrigued with Gehennick, because Gehennick she's very well regarded by her people. And when she first meets Gehennick, Gehennick comes to the Allison store, and she won't even talk to Susan Allison. She doesn't talk to white people. She lets her nephew do the talking. But in time, she comes to trust Susan Allison, and so she gets Susan Allison to write letters for her and do things for her and help her out. And in return, Allison sells some of her goods and so forth. Anyway, you wonder what happened to the wealth of these women after the Indian Act in the 1870s, I guess, and the confinement to reserves and access to grazing land was cut off. And anyway, the story of Gehennick that Susan Allison tells us is entwined with the story of Gehennick's nephew, who's a bit of a wild and crazy guy he's known as Ashnola George. And he gets into a fight when he's drunk with another guy who's drunk, and he shoots him dead. And he is given a prison sentence at the BC Pen for 10 years. This is sometime in the probably about 1880. And he's sent down to the BC Pen, and then Gehennick gets word from the Tyee, that's the Arthur McBride, the head of the BC Penitentiary at the time, that Ashnola George has died. So she wants the body back. So she comes to Susan Allison and she says, "Could you write to the Tyee and tell him we want the body back?" So Allison gets this eloquent letter from McBride. It's in the Canadian Archive. And yes, we'll send the body up. Well, of course, the Similkameen men have to go down and pack it in from New West. So they bring a body back in a coffin over the Hope Trail. It comes in. Gehennick looks at it, and without even opening it, she says, "No, that's not George. Not him." And yes, it's George. The Tyee wouldn't lie to you. Anyway, open the coffin, it's not George. It's far too short. So back they go with this body, and Susan Allison writes again, and another body is sent up, and Joseph McKay, he's a good guy in the story. He was the Indian agent, and he was very much an advocate for the Similkameen and others in the interior. But he gets on the case of Arthur McBride, and he takes it to the federal government. So McBride says, "Oh, yes, all right, we'll send you, and we'll send it to Hope, so they don't have to go so far." So down they go to Hope. They get another body, they bring it up, and Gehennick says, "No, that's not it." Sure enough, they open the coffin, and it's a Chinaman. Yeah. Pigtail and everything. So back goes the coffin. McKay gets on. He starts writing furious letters to the coast, and finally they do send, at their own expense, another body all the way to Similkameen, and it's still not George. So Gehennick just gives up. But then a few years later, around the turn of the last century, Gehennick comes to Susan Allison and says, there was a guy from Enderby who came here and told me that he met an Okanagan man in England when he was over there during the Boer War. And the guy said to him, "You go down to Ashnola and see my aunt and uncle and try and get me out of this fix." He was in I'm getting it wrong. Susan Allison hears through Gehennick that Ashnola George was seen in the Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. So Susan Allison writes to good old Buffalo Bill, and he sends her a very polite letter saying he'd asked all the guys who were working for him, and nobody knew. There was no Okanagan man there. So that's the end of it. But it's not the end of it, because Harry Robinson, an important storyteller, Similkameen storyteller, who Wendy Wickwire, who was a UVic anthropologist, transcribed a lot of his Syilx story. She spent a lot of time with him in the 70s and into the 80s, and she published 2 or 3 books based on his storytelling. And he tells a story that circulated amongst the Similkameen people about Ashnola George. Ashnola George, in Harry's story, became a captive in an English circus. And a fellow who was in the Boer War from Enderby, came in the early part of the 20th century to visit Gehennick and her brother and said, I met up with your nephew in England, and he really wants to come back to Canada. He wants you to talk to the Indian agent, and he is in a traveling show in England being displayed. Now, I hate to have to tell you that this was very common in Europe in the 19th century. There were human zoos and people from all over the world being displayed, people considered inferior and what have you. And so Gehennick goes to, she comes to, or Harry Robbins had said, Gehennick and her husband tried very hard to get in touch with authorities, and they were never able to find him. He was never returned to the Similkameen. So it's really a story about how structural racism functioned in earlier BC and how it's an extremely tragic story, but it also gives us a sense of how history gets transmitted as well. So this is when I say what we are looking for is a kind of trace of a trace, and hard to know what to trust. And this is one of her essays that she wanted to publish about Native women she had known was called Kind Penquinac, or the Princess Julia. And this was the daughter of Incowmasket, lived a wonderful life growing up. Susan Allison had known her. And Margaret Ormsby says she was the last hereditary chief of the Similkameen. I'm not sure. Anyway, Incowmasket was the chief at the time, that in the late 19th century, early 20th. So in an account of Penquinac, Susan Allison talks about how she came to visit one time. Penquinac was still quite a young woman, and she had a son. And this is when Susan Allison's youngest children were still quite small. Anyway, Allison writes, she looked very unhappy. Soon after, I heard that her husband had left her and gone away from her people, and she's critical of Incowmasket because he made a bad marriage for his daughter. But anyway, later I heard with great regret that she had gone to live with a white man. I believe he was kind to her in a way, but she died an early and terrible death. Poor Penquinac, always kind to the poor, the helpless, the indigent, kind to her mother, her father, and her grandfather, to all she met. Let kind thoughts be her monument. You see this importance of commemorating people is with her. Also, I'll end with the story, as Susan Allison tells it, of the wild McLean boys. Do you know of the great BC frontier myth, the McLeans? They were mixed heritage young men. Their father was the chief factor at Kamloops, and their mother was I think she was the daughter of Kamloops Louis, says Susan Allison, and I'm not sure who that is. But anyway, a high-ranking family. Annie McLean was their sister, and these 3 fellows went on quite a tear in the late 1870s in the interior of BC, and the settlers were very worried. But it coincided with a lot of the things going on with Indigenous people being very upset at the Consolidated Land Act that was passed, that was dispossessing them of lands that had been promised to them by Governor Douglas and so forth. So it's all enmeshed in that. It's not just some alcoholic half-breeds. It's much more than that. But these 3 were all hung eventually because they did shoot a fellow, Johnny Usher, I think his name was, who tried to come in and arrest them. There was a bit of terrorizing of the settlers. Anyway, Susan Allison is very much on the side of the McLeans, which is very unusual because these were, outlaws that should be brought to justice to most of the other white settlers. And in 1879, after they had killed Johnny Usher, they were on the run. And they were in the Okanagan and going by Susan Allison's house there in what is now West Kelowna. And Susan Allison saw them passing by and came out, and one of them took out his gun and pointed it at one of the young Allison children. And so, but then a local Indigenous guy intervened and said something, and that was fine. He put the gun down. But he was one of the McLean brothers, and he was with his sister. His sister, Annie McLean, she says, was brought up in a convent and most accomplished. She was in Kamloops society and met a man of high standing in the province who just happened to be John Andrew Mara, but Susan Allison doesn't mention that, and became engaged to him. They were very intimate, too much so. Then he went down to the lower country and married the daughter of a man of standing there, leaving the poor girl to bear her disgrace the best way she could. The brothers were furious. If they could have got that man, they would have killed him then and there. And she also writes about how the McLean brothers were also fighting for their people, for their people's rights on their mother's side and so forth. So it's a very different take on the McLeans and what motivated them. Anyway, Allison ends by saying, Annie, a fair girl wearing a sunbonnet, passed riding a side saddle and carrying an infant. Poor girl, she was going to her mother's people, probably in the Nicola or something. The Indians are good to those of kin to them. Anything going on there with her commentary on this?
A comparison of how white people, a girl who was disgraced, was shunned and
Yeah.
the child was illegitimate. And if you were a native, children were always welcome.
Yeah.
That's my take.
Yeah. Still, I've been living part of the time in Alberta, which is not easy to do, let me tell you. But anyway, it's the real estate is a lot cheaper, and I have a lot of family there and maybe a grandchild on the way. But that said, there's such a presence of Métis everywhere. You know, at talks and things, they will say, we are on the ancestral territory, and I didn't do a land acknowledgement here before I started because I was too nervous. Anyway, we are on the traditional territory of the Treaty 7 people and the Region 3 Métis people of Alberta, you know, but there's not, BC doesn't have that sense of people of I think you're right, there was more inclusion. And notice how Anne McLean has been brought up, well-educated. She's wearing a bonnet. She's riding side saddle. She's doing everything it takes to imitate the colonizer. She thinks she's one of them. Mara proposes to her, but to him, she's not the real item. And it just gives us a sense of the position, the difficult position of many women at that time. Anyway, and just to conclude, there are many women characters in Allison's long poems. If you can fight your way through Incowmasket and Quiniscoe and think about it a bit and reread it, it's actually quite interesting. Allison seems to take the part of the Indigenous people when, in her poem Incowmasket, when he's considering conversion. The only chiefs who stand up at their meeting about this, the only ones who support conversion are either they're just about dead with some kind of fever and they're full of the fire and brimstone of the newly converted, and you know, or they're dressed in coyote garb, which is a sure sign that something is wrong, and so on. It's really very well crafted, and she knows enough about Syilx's story to make use of some of the symbolism. But there are lots of women in Incowmasket and Quiniscoe, sisters and others who are part of grieving for Quiniscoe, Incowmasket, and so forth, his various wives. And anyway, I hope that that's gone some way towards trying to convince you that there was a presence of women, and women had agency, and they exercised it as much as they could, wherever they found themselves in the social structure. And they, they had a voice as well. And we know the obstacles that settler women faced in trying to have some sort of audience, women weren't defined as subjects under the law in Canada until the 19s, right? So,
do we have any knowledge about Susan's connection to Tamil people in Sri Lanka?
Oh.
Where she was born. Would you recall what age she left Sri Lanka?
She was 8 years old when they left Ceylon, and then they lived with family till she was about 14 in England because the family fell on hard times. There was a bit of a depression then in Ceylon. The price of coffee plummeted or something, but her family had been in Ceylon, an extended family, for a long time. Now, a really interesting thing that I learned from Diane Stern's book, there's an account by one of Susan Allison's granddaughters, Evadne Mackenzie, about how Alice Allison, who was Susan's daughter, and Susan, when they lived together in Vancouver, they meditated twice a day. And I think it was a form of Theravada Buddhism, maybe, that they had learned, or that Susan had learned through her Sri Lankan connection.
Do you know about her parents?
And I think maybe the parents, but I don't know. I really don't know, though. I can't substantiate that. But very clearly, Allison was described as a person without creed at her funeral. And she was very interested in Eastern religions all her life, and she was a theosophist. She followed theosophy, and when Oliver Lodge came to visit, he was a big theosophy leader. In Vancouver, she went to see him. She met Krishnamurti, and she had published some essays in the Eastern Star, it was called. It was a publication. And some of her essays are in Fairhand manuscript at the BC Archives. One is on the eternal now. And so she was very, she had a pretty broadened out sense of spirituality, I think, which may have accounted, I think that time in Asia may have been affected that.
She's in the census as Church of Scotland.
Oh, yeah.
That would have been her inscription, I imagine.
It likely, yeah. Yeah, I think, well, it would have been, the Church of Scotland is kind of it would be an offshoot of the Anglican Church. It would be the Protestant. Yeah, because she was christened in an Anglican cathedral in Colombo. So I suspect that was kind of the, hard to say. Her father was from Scotland, and but he was brought up as a Protestant, likely in the more moderate, not in the Free Church of Scotland, the Presbyterians that messed me up so much. But I think probably in name an Anglican, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Nora, I think, was a murderer himself.
Oh, was he?
Yeah,
Oh.
I think he boasted about having shot an Indian, and this is how we should deal with Indians.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
If necessary, we should shoot them.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was Mara Canyon named after him?
Oh, yes, in Mara Lake. Yeah.
A couple other threads there. I think the McBride who was the warden at the BC Pen, I think that's the father of Richard McBride.
Yes, I think it is.
That's right.
He was. Yes.
So, yeah. So, and the other interesting story is the next generation after the McLean brothers. One of the sons, correct me if I'm wrong, is George McLean, who goes on to fight in the Boer War and then is a decorated hero in World War I. And the Nicola people have recently had a veteran's cross at his graveyard in the Douglas Lake.
Okay. Yeah.
So he was quite a esteemed figure.
Yes, interesting.
Yeah.
And I think there's a McLean descendant as well who's a famous rodeo cowboy, isn't there?
Wait, is Kenny McLean?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Also, Ian Tyson made a song about that.
Yeah.
Ian Tyson made a song about the
Huh.
McLean brothers.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and yes, yeah. And George Bowring wrote a novel called Shoot,
That's right.
you know, just completely dressed up like George Bowring's writing often is, but yeah.
I think the story of Susan Allison is her father passed away and Susan's mother met up with a guy by the name of Glennie.
Right.
Glennie had a way of spending money, so
Yeah.
he would come to Canada, so he went around the Horn. They ended up in Hope, and Susan and her sister and mother ended up destitute in Hope.
Did he abandon them?
Yeah.
Oh, he abandoned them, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Once the money was gone, let's use it.
He just took off,
Yeah.
and he was,
So
yeah,
his sister married Edgar Dudney.
right.
Yes.
Good thing, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's where John Paul Allison got some of his perks too, because it's his brother-in-law.
Well, I know that Susan and her mother ran a school for a while in Hope.
That's why they moved to Hope, yes.
Yeah, I think they had Glennie bought some land just outside of Hope, along where the Coquihalla, or where the KVR rail trail is now. And they lived out there for a little while. There's an interesting letter that Susan Allison wrote to her daughter, Louisa Johnston, up here in Princeton, where this is written in the 20s, and she's remembering how they made the most of it in this, this house with like paper walls and, and they were using their silver. And Susan said, we used to make great ceremony of our dinners and with silver. And Thomas Glennie, her father's second husband, who was soon to desert them, used to say, he was really horrible. But, you get the sense of these British middle-class people just still, no matter what, they're going to keep up the decorum.
A point to ponder is, did Judge Haynes die at the Allison Ranch?
He did, yeah.
They put him in a canoe and sent him down the river with somebody. The canoe overturned in the river, and now the canoe is more famous than, because there's one found in Winter Lake that had to be that. There was one found in Syilx Lake that had to be that canoe. And there is a canoe in the museum.
And it's more famous than Judge Haynes.
Well, I think so.
Yeah.
There's a canoe in Syilx that they say could have been.
They found the body, eh?
Yeah. And the other thing is about Lily. Lily stayed with the whites all of her life.
Yeah.
And she married white people.
She did.
All the way down the line.
Yeah.
And so she never did go back to.
No, not much. Maybe occasionally, like in.
Maybe, but I
yeah.
think the time she.
Yeah.
She's the one that worked in Allison's store.
Uh-huh.
And also
they
sent her to school in Hope too.
Right.
So they treated her okay.
Yeah,
Just didn't
yeah.
admit it.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that the dismissal, I know that there were, until 1999, the Allison family reunions didn't include the Indigenous descendants, but after 99, they did. They have.
There was lots of Indigenous people at the Allison reunion.
Yeah, right. And so, but there were still some of the old guard who were not happy about that. Oh, interesting. Okay, that's interesting. Oh, there's Spencer. Okay. Yeah, so it's kind of, it's a real study in the shifts and changes in an area over much time, the ideological shifts, and the, but it seems to me that the some of Allison's children who were older, or her son Robert Will, married Rachel, who was a Quiniscoe's daughter, I think, and they had 6 or 7 or 8 children. Susan Allison was very close to those children. One of their sons, Henry, was killed a month before the Second World War ended in France. And there are letters to his grandmother, to Susan Allison, and he'd gone to visit some of her relatives in London while he was overseas. And, you know, and his name shows up in the Princeton paper for getting the highest grades in the school and things. And it seems to me the world really shifted and became much more, seems like there was a divide between the older children who'd grown up in close association with Indigenous kids around and things, and then some of the younger ones. I don't know.
There's also an economic issue. I mean, when the older kids were growing up, the Allison family had a lot more. When John kind of lost West Bank and all that, and was kind of relegated to having to stay down here, there's a real shift in the way the attitude between the older and the younger, because the older grew up with a lot more.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
Look at the younger families, I think that's where a lot of the divide comes from as well. In my family, a lot of the older families as well stay together, whereas the younger families not so much.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things at play there, and there's a lot of bitterness too, because when John died, they didn't have much. Susan didn't have much after that.
That seems to be the case, because in her letters to her daughter in Princeton, in that when she's writing her memoirs for the paper, she's been asked to write something. She says, "It's only need that has led me to write this, and I am going to have to leave out a whole lot." You know, so it's my suspicions way back when I first read the recollections after a kind of a whiny afternoon at Quails Gate in the 1990s were confirmed by that. So anyway, thank you very much.
Good.